Thank you so much. Welcome. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Cynthia Mondesir, and I am one of the senior managers at the Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action. Our office is located in Ottawa, and we'd like to recognize that we are on the traditional and ceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So founded after the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, FAFIA is a coalition of women's organizations in Canada whose work focuses on defending women's human rights and advancing women's equality, especially through engaging with UN treaty bodies and advocating for the implementation of Canada's international human rights commitments. Today, FAFIA issued a new report on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police entitled The Toxic Culture of the RCMP, Misogyny, Racism, and Violence Against Women in Canada's National Police Force. We are joined today by three of the co-authors, Shivangi Misra, FAFIA Senior Manager of Human Rights, Dr. Pam Palmater, Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and chair Indigenous governance at Ryerson, Shelagh, FAFIA Chair of Human Rights Committee, and we are very thankful for the participation and support of Senator Kim Pate. Passing it on to you, Senator.
Thank you very much. And I join you from the shores of the Kitchissippi, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, also known as Ottawa. I'm very pleased to be hosting this. I think the issues, the systemic issues that this report raises, as well as the many instances, sadly, of and horrifically of discrimination, are echoed in a number of institutions right now in this country, military, prisons, as well as within the police. And while there has been a lot of effort to try and address these issues, we see the very real need for the kinds of calls for accountability and oversight that FAFIA has brought forward. So I'd like to now invite those of you who have participated in the creation of this report to comment, and we will be hearing from Shivangi Misra, as well as Dr. Pam Palmater and Shelagh Day. So over to you, and thank you very much for your work.
Shelagh, I think you're on mute again.
Thank you, Senator. Can you hear me now? I'm very pleased to be here this morning to tell you about FAFIA's newest report. Our study of reports from legal experts, public officials, civil society organizations, frontline workers, journalists, and international and domestic inquiries that have been issued over the last decade documents the shocking evidence of systemic discrimination and violence against women perpetrated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP's culture of misogyny, racism, and homophobia, identified by Justice Michel Bastarache in his report, Broken Dreams, Broken Lives, affects not only the treatment of women who are employed by the RCMP, but also the treatment of the women whom the RCMP is intended to serve. The devastating impacts for women of this toxic culture are known, but they have not been addressed effectively. Here's what our report documents. The notorious record of sexual harassment by male RCMP officers against their female colleagues. The high rates of unfounding of sexual assault allegations, particularly in rural and northern Canada, where the RCMP is the principal police force. The pattern of dismissive or abusive responses by RCMP officers to women's reports of domestic violence. The failures to prevent violence against Indigenous women and girls, and the failures to investigate thoroughly their disappearances and murders, which is something that is now known worldwide. The shocking evidence of overt violence against Indigenous women and girls by RCMP officers, including rape, assault, excessive use of force, unnecessary strip searching, harassment, and sexualized verbal abuse. These acts and failures violate women's right to equality and non-discrimination. The Government of Canada has obligations under both domestic and international law. They are these. First, to ensure that public officials, such as the RCMP, do not perpetrate violence against women. And second, to ensure that all public officials act with diligence to prevent violence against women and to investigate, prosecute, and remedy violence when it occurs. These obligations are not being met by Canada. Canada cannot have a credible national action plan on violence against women or a credible national action plan on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls until the culture of misogyny and racism in the RCMP is rooted out. This is a core institution of Canada. Women are entitled to employment and police services that support and foster our equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelagh. I have joined on as a co-author and researcher of this report because of the very serious nature of violence to women in Canada by the RCMP. Indigenous women and girls have long been targets of sexualized violence and exploitation at the hands of state actors, including the police. In the earliest days, Canada's National Police Force, there were reports of many officers who withheld food rations from First Nation communities in order to extort sex from young Indigenous girls. This abuse has continued into the present, with Indigenous women and girls reporting violent rapes, beatings by the RCMP in police cars, jail cells, and after being driven to remote locations. And Indigenous women and girls are scared to report sexualized violence because, in their words, they either rape you or they arrest you. That's very clear that we have a national public safety crisis on our hands. In Justice Bastarash's report, he expressed shock at the large number of violent rapes committed by male RCMP officers against their own female RCMP officers. And if female RCMP officers are not safe from sexual assaults by male officers, it should be no surprise that marginalized Indigenous women and girls are not safe either. Human Rights Watch documented reports of violent sexual assaults by Indigenous women and girls by RCMP officers, which left widespread palpable fear of the RCMP, the kind of fear they've only seen in post-conflict countries where security forces commit atrocious acts of violence. When confronted with this report, the RCMP's response was, "Don't worry about it, I've got your back." More recently, when confronted with allegations of systemic racism based on the evidence, both the RCMP commissioner and deputy commissioners, their response was an astounding denial to the problem. Their response was, there's no systemic racism in the force. It's not pervasive. It's certainly not in every corner of the organization. It's a few bad apples. Yet the Broken Dreams report found that the RCMP have a toxic culture of misogyny, racism, and violence that can be found at every level of the RCMP in every geographic area of Canada. Our report documents all of these previous reports about racism and sexualized violence in the RCMP, and it makes it clear that the RCMP are not capable of fixing themselves. That's why we support the many calls for a truly independent review of the RCMP and support for women. We must not allow one more rape of another woman in Canada by the RCMP. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Shelagh. The situation is made worse by the fact that despite the many documented accounts of violence against women by the RCMP officers and their failures to protect women from the violence in the community, there is still no effective accountability and oversight mechanism in place. The Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, which accepts and investigates complaints against the RCMP, is not an independent mechanism, as complaints against the RCMP are mainly investigated by the RCMP itself. The CRCC can review the decisions and they make recommendations, but these recommendations are not legally binding, and the RCMP commissioner makes the final decision on their implementation. Justice Michelle Basrash, in his report, he concluded that the RCMP is not capable of changing itself from within, and that the time has come for the Government of Canada to ask some hard questions about the structure and governance of federal policing. Given the shocking and growing evidence of systemic discrimination, sexual abuse, and violence by the RCMP officers, both as an employer as well as a service provider, presented in our report as well, we call on the government, among many other key recommendations, to immediately initiate an extensive, independent, and an in-depth review of the RCMP, as called for by the Bachrach report, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Indigenous Women. The goal of such a review must be to determine if and how radical changes can be made to RCMP oversight, transparency, accountability, structure, culture, and its practices. This process must include women, especially Indigenous women, and feminist experts as key participants in any decision-making regarding the future of the RCMP as an institution. Finally, we would like to note that this report reflects the views of the Feminist Alliance for International Action. They do not reflect the views or positions of any of the community groups or organizations that are referenced in the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Prue, will you be letting us know who has questions from the media?
Definitely, Senator Pate. So merci. Thank you. We'll now take questions. Please use the function raise hand on Zoom. S'il vous plaît, vous pouvez utiliser la fonction lever la main sur Zoom. And please direct your question to one of the panelists because we don't have that much time. So first question is from Kirsty Kirkup, the Globe and Mail. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to ask a question. I'm wondering if you could possibly please speak more to the call for an external review of the RCMP, specifically who should be responsible for setting the terms for said review should the federal government respond to this specific call.
Well, I can start to answer that. Christy, thank you very much for the question. I think it's incredibly important. When we say it has to be independent and external, of course, the terms of reference for such a review are very important. You'll probably recall that some of us were not completely happy with the terms of reference, for example, for the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So we know that the terms of reference for such an inquiry or examination are extremely important. I think what that means is that, yes, the government has to be the body that sets the terms of reference, but there needs to be really solid consultation about what those terms of reference are before they're finalized. The appointment of people is also extraordinarily important. We saw the appointment of Marie Deschamps, for example, to inquire into the military and the problems of sexual violence in the military. It's that kind of appointment, that kind of independence that I think we're looking for here. We need senior expertise with consultation with women, particularly Indigenous women, in the process of doing it.
And just as a follow-up, if I may, I'm just wondering if there I know the report begins with a letter to both the Public Safety Minister as well as the Minister of Status of Women. Has there been any further dialogue with the government on this? I'm just trying to gauge, and of course we'll give them an opportunity to respond, but the level of receptiveness from the federal government to perhaps engage in launching such an external review?
Again, I'll try to answer that, Christy. We don't know that yet. We'd like to know. We're looking forward to it. We're very interested in engaging with Ministers Mendicino and Minister Ian. We have noted, and we think this is extremely important, that in both their mandate letters from the Prime Minister, those ministers are essentially directed to deal with systemic discrimination in core institutions. And that is exactly what we're talking about. And Minister Ian is directed to accelerate reform in the RCMP. So we know that the RCMP is on their agenda, and we know that they've named it also in the federal pathway that has to do with the National Action Plan on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So far, what's been said is essentially that. It's general. We want something very concrete, and we're looking forward to engaging with them about the very concrete way of moving forward on this immediately. Thank you.
I think it's also important to note that prior to the national inquiry, we advocated for a specific review of the police and the RCMP. This is under the current government's tenure, and that was not included. The Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women called for a specific review of the RCMP because of the reports of sexualized violence against Indigenous women and girls. And we advocated with this current government for that independent review. And so there's been a multitude of reports, the Human Rights Watch and others, that have consistently requested an independent review of the RCMP on both the sexualized violence, but also systemic racism. I mean, Canadians were marching in the streets against systemic racism in policing in general. And despite our numerous requests in writing in the public and in meetings, they have not responded with a decision one way or the other.
Merci. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Christy. I see no other hands. One hand manifested. So, Erica Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking my question today. I noted in the report's introduction that it says, consequently, the goal of reform of Canada's National Police Force, if reform is possible, and then it sort of goes on. But I'm curious, does the Canadian Feminist Alliance believe that reform of the RCMP is possible? And if not, how should that sort of inform any sort of process or action on the recommendations in the report?
Who would like to respond? Shelagh?
I'll respond. The recommendations say that, Erica, because we wanted to leave open the possibility that has been raised by many people in the community about whether or not the force can continue in the way that it currently is. I noticed, for example, and I'm sure you do too, that the province of British Columbia, an all-party committee, has just said they're considering getting rid of the RCMP as their provincial police force and creating a new police force of their own. So the moment for change seems to be upon us. And we want to leave open all the possibilities of how reform might happen with the RCMP, including, and Mr. Justice Bastarache has also suggested this, some breaking up of the institution into different sections because of different parts of their work. So that phrase, I say again, is there to leave open the possibilities of what would be the most effective reform here in order to accomplish the goal of achieving a police force that actually works for and can protect women in the country.
Do you have a follow-up, Erica?
No, that's everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. I see no further questions, so that will put an end to the press conference. Ceci termine la conférence de presse. Merci beaucoup à tous d'avoir été présents. Thank you all for being there. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.